Hello everybody and welcome to this Saïd Business School, University of Oxford webinar on what might the builders of Brexit scenarios need to consider. My name is Damien Hughes and I'm here with our panel today. Rafael Ramirez, he's the director of the Oxford Scenarios Programme and Senior Fellow in Strategy. We're also joined by Dr. Cynthia Selin. She's an Associate Fellow of the Saïd Business School, University of Oxford, and also Assistant Professor, School of Sustainability and School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University in the US. We're also joined by Dr. Trudy Lang. She's an Associate Fellow of the Business School here in Oxford as well, and has contributed to the school's Scenarios Programme, also the Oxford Diploma in Strategy Innovation, as well as many other custom programs in the school. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Dr. Ramirez, but I'd also like to remind everybody to please do submit your questions as we go through, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. Thank you very much for tuning in today, and over to you, Rafael.
Thank you very much, Damien, and very welcome to everybody that is online. This is being recorded, and we will send out the recording of this webinar to all of those that have signed in tomorrow. We have developed in Oxford a distinctive approach to scenario planning, which is documented in our book that came out in March, Strategic Reframing the Oxford Scenario Planning Approach. And the first three questions that one would need to consider in any case, whether it's Brexit scenarios or any other kinds of scenarios, is to be very clear on who these scenarios are for. Just as an example, if we were building scenarios on post-Brexit worlds for the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University, it would be a different set of scenarios than if we were building this for the head of the medical school or for the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of research. So each of them would have their own distinctive issues. So the first question that one would need to settle is who exactly will be the user and what purposes will the scenarios planning serve? Are they to develop new strategies? Are they to change the risk register? Are they to have a better conversation with important trading partners and so on and so forth? And finally, to be very concrete on exactly when and how the scenarios will be used and what value is going to be derived from there. And we have found over the years in the strategic work we do and in the Oxford Scenarios Planning approach that a lot of bad scenario work happens because those three questions are not dealt with. And if you don't have a user and a use, the work might very well be useless. Now, having looked at those issues, there's a number of issues here that we would like to consider that are specific to Brexit. The first one is how protracted this uncertainty is going to be. Christine Lagarde from the International Monetary Fund today, interviewed by the Financial Times, called for a clear process and a clear timetable so that investment confidence returns and that people know roughly what to expect when. As we speak, this has not been settled, and one of the questions is whether this is going to be a spurts and starts kind of complexity, a continuous and orderly complexity as you would hope for, or a continued mess more or less like climate change that we all have to live with. And it's not very clear what spillovers this might unleash elsewhere outside Europe and the UK. It's also possible that Brexit may not happen. There are people saying that the longer it is delayed, the more time one has to think about alternatives, which might be good for the UK negotiating position, but bad for uncertainty. A second sort of set of issues that is on your screen is how widespread might this be? Is it going to be contained within Europe and the UK, or will it affect a number of other countries and regions, perhaps more importantly than some parts of Europe? And a related issue is how fundamental is the change going to be? Can it be held with existing units of analysis For example, is the two-party parliamentary system in the UK a viable system, or will it need to be changed? Will the House of Lords be changed as a result of this? Certainly it appears that Scotland may very well separate from the UK, and it will no longer be the United Kingdom but the disunited kingdom. And so maybe we need new units of analysis to consider of possible futures rather than staying with units of analysis we have now. And a related question is whether the existing institutions be able to handle the transitions well, or whether new institutions or changes to the institutions will be required. Just as a comparison, you will remember the creation of the G20 as the financial crisis unfolded in 2008. Might there be a need for different arrangements and institutions than there is today? Now, my colleagues and I are planning to speak for about 15 minutes maximum. And we've set the questions at three levels, totally arbitrarily. One are UK level questions. A second is EU level questions or European level questions. And a third one will be global level questions. And after that, we'll open it for questions and answers and comments. And Damien is going to be receiving these. He will field some of them to me, and I will direct the issues to Cynthia, Trudy, or I will deal with them myself. That's the plan. So starting with the UK ones, and you can see a number of lists here listed in your screen. One unclear situation is whether there will be a post-Brexit clear plan coming from either the government or senior members of the business community that will lay out a path that investors and citizens are clear about, or whether it'll be a mess that people will have to muddle through for quite some time. Related to this is this has been a very divisive referendum. And there's lots of divisions geographically, socially, economically. It is not clear what is going to happen with this. The Financial Times this morning had a very interesting article that London has gone from contributing the equivalent of the first 25 cities, excluding London, of tax to the UK. So London had contributed more tax to the UK purse than the next 25 cities combined 10 years ago, to 37 cities this past year. So if London is going to be affected by Brexit much more than the country, it might decrease the division of wealth between the country and London, but it may also decrease how much public money the rest of the country has. A related issue, of course, is the size of the United Kingdom. Will Scotland separate and other parts possibly? And if so, how quickly? And importantly, what effects will this have on nuclear weapons, which are, the bulk of them are now located in Scotland? And how will the remaining UK, or the former UK, you can read the acronym for the former UK, deal with nuclear weapons that are stationed in Scotland? Unclear what effects this will have on employment, underemployment, unemployment. It's not clear as we speak whether the two-party system will continue or if both main parties will split and new parties might arise. It's not clear what kind of migration process, both inward and outward, this might give rise to. In this university, a lot of senior administrators from the Vice-Chancellor on down have been speaking very loudly to the EU citizens employed by the university and to the EU students and postdocs and doctoral students that they will be welcome to remain. But some of the future staff, faculty and students might choose not to come to the UK. The roles of the media have been important in the referendum. What roles they're going to play post-referendum, both in the UK and about the UK elsewhere, is unclear. And it is not clear what effects Brexit will have on how the UK will deal with climate change, possible floods if the London Thames barrier fails, East Anglia, and so on and so forth. So that's the first set of issues that we thought, and it's an incomplete set, but it's a good start. And of course, in a scenario, you would relate them to each other. Cynthia, can you speak about the first two of these ones on the UK science?
Yes, thank you, Raphael. I'm happy to. Hello, I'm Cynthia Celine. I'm coming to you from the west coast of the United States. So as Raphael is setting up, there are a litany of issues and uncertainties that are on the table. And each of these are going to be more or less relevant for you and your organization. So we're trying to give you a sort of a taste of how you might begin to work with these uncertainties in a deeper level. As a social scientist focused on the societal implications of emerging technology, I've been paying attention to Brexit in light of scientific innovation and the development of new technologies. And there are really three key uncertainties that are striking. One has to do with the mobility of researchers, which is central to the production of new knowledge. Second relates to rethinking and managing a new set of regulatory standards governing innovation. And the third, funding. So to take the first, there are worries over brain drain. We haven't really known how important the mobility of researchers and other labor, goods, and services has been for the US and others to collaborate with Britain. Now we have this live experiment to see what's mattered. This week in the US, I'm trying to hire a Ukrainian philosopher of science who's relocating from Singapore, currently staying in Tel Aviv with her Israeli partner. So this is the world of science today. Such difference and diversity is thought to foster innovation. In the US context, getting visas and such is doable. It's a regular thing we do. There are some costs, legal expertise, it's time intensive, but it's sort of integrated into the way we do business. I guess it's another question entirely as to whether or not foreign scientists will feel welcome in a post-Brexit UK. So the UK is facing a live experiment, not a controlled one with neatly isolated variables. Soon you're going to learn how much things like mobility matter, not to mention the case of the ease of trade or the unification of things like patents that drive innovation. The second point relates to this tangled skein of different regulatory systems. This matters greatly for energy, pharma, transportation, etc. These regulatory issues and the ways that technology is governed, these can be reconciled in more or less elegant ways. Lastly, funding. In terms of scientific discovery, on top of the list, there's a question about remaining a part of Horizon 2020. This is about 75 billion euros. It's a program of research grants, and it'll be essential that Brits keep access to that. So lots of complicated rewiring of the innovation system that scenarios could investigate further. Raphael.
Thank you, Cynthia. So this is, you can see in these screens, a new book coming out in September with my colleague Ulf Mannervik, where we are looking at a much more networked world. And in the UK and the companies that are domiciled here are not going to be part of the EU. A big question is what kind of relationships do they need to change to do business together in this network world. With the Brexit has a number of losers and a number of winners, and one clear set of winners is contractual lawyers. They will have a lot of work to redraw contracts and collaborations in a networked world. Now moving on to European level issues. There's a post this morning from our colleague Tina Fordham of Citibank, and we have some Citibank colleagues online, who basically says Brexit is not going to be the biggest political uncertainty this year. There will probably be a referendum in Italy on the second half of this year. So one of the questions is whether Brexit is the beginning of a lot of referenda and a lot of breakups, not only of countries from the EU, but countries within the EU breaking up. And it is not yet clear whether the stance that the EU will take towards the negotiation is to make it very hard for other people or expensive for other people to leave, or whether it will be accommodating, in which case other people might want to leave as well, and whether it's going to accept or not accept a separate Scotland or a separate Catalonia and so on. We do not then know if Brexit is a one-off or not, and we do not know how the French elections in 2017 and the scheduled ones in Germany in 2018 will affect matters. We do not know how the economies that are in trouble, whether it's Greece, Italy, Portugal, and so on, will make it. We have no idea what the future of the euro is. We do not know whether inequality in wealth will increase. And if it did increase, what effects would it have? If you look at the beginning of the issues that led to the First World War, in a wonderful book by our colleague Margaret Macmillan, there are similarities of the kinds of things that eventually led to war already unleashing in Europe. We do not know how many migrants will try to cross the Mediterranean, not only from Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, but also from sub-Saharan Africa. And we therefore don't know whether the Schengen Agreement will persist. Also in Europe, and this is the next slide, it's not clear where financial activity that has basically driven the wealth creation of the City of London, not only with bankers, but lawyers, accountants, and other financial services, where this will be spreading out to other cities on the continent or indeed beyond the continent. We do not know about the xenophobia and violence that has become patent not only in Eastern Europe over the last few months, but also within the UK, leading, for example, to the murder of the Member of Parliament, Joe Cox. At a bigger level of violence, we don't know what the nuclear weapons landscape is going to look like when and if the UK leaves the EU. France will be the only EU member with nuclear weapons in front of a more belligerent Russia, and the UK will have to figure out, as I said earlier, what it does with Scottish-based nuclear weapons. We do not know how climate change will affect the EU in the future and which parts might be most affected, whether it's through floods, droughts, lacks of water, and so on. The roles of the media, the roles of religion, and in fact the role of the EU as a center of innovation and research, as Cynthia was speaking about, may also be affected. I'm now going to move to the last set of slides, global ones, and I'll ask my colleague Trudy Lang, who is officially in Perth, but on her way there from the UK via Geneva to intervene. Trudy, can you speak to these slides, please?
Hello everyone. It's a real privilege for me to be here today discussing scenario planning and the UK People's Majority's decision to leave the European Union for 43 years, because scenarios will be incredibly helpful in this context. There's a number of global issues here that you can see on the screen, and I just wanted to give a little bit of introduction to these and then run through them just very quickly. In terms of this issue, I feel personally a very deep connection to it. I'm Australian, however I lived in the UK for 6 years while I was doing my doctorate at Oxford, and for 4 years in Switzerland and France, where I worked with the World Economic Forum and the OECD. One of the key projects I worked on during this time was scenarios for Mongolia, and also with involved with one of the projects on Russia. I'm now moving from Geneva to Australia, as Raphael says, working in strategy and scenarios with leaders of Australian public and private sector organisations. But my interest in Brexit and the decision of the UK to leave the European Union is also because I'm an Australian with British roots. So my ancestors made a decision to leave the UK in around about 1850, and this was at the time of one of the real growth spurts of the British Empire, which spawned countries like Australia. Then 100 years later, the UK signalled a switch to Europe when they indicated they wanted to join the European Economic Community. And this came as a shock to some in Australia, as it was perceived as Britain turning away from the Commonwealth, its own family. So now we see the UK planning to leave the EU. So I mention this because we see this decision in this larger context of the UK deciding, taking a different path, and our own involvement and relationship to that. And this history, I think, is interesting and important because it will mean that different countries, people in different countries, will have different perceptions about the UK's decision to leave the EU. And this is why the scenarios are so useful, because they allow these perceptions and assumptions to be made explicit and maybe even challenged. So on the screen, one of the first questions is really, how will the UK be perceived once it is no longer in the EU, and how will it be perceived by different countries around the world? It matters because the UK is the largest recipient of foreign direct investment in Europe, and it receives investment from over 70 countries from around the world. The UK is also seen as the gateway for many countries to the EU. So there's a number of questions that will, now that the UK is leaving the EU, what this actually means for foreign direct investment into the UK, and what the perception about the opportunities in the UK will be. So a key question here is, how will the pace and nature of Brexit negotiations impact the investment decisions of international companies? Alternatively is, how will the EU be perceived by countries around the world once the UK is no longer a member? And the UK currently accounts for 17% of the EU's economy. And for Australia, the EU is our largest source of foreign direct investment and our third largest trading partner. Yet when you break it down, the UK is the dominant market here. 54% of Australia's trading services and 30% of its trading goods actually goes to the UK, and the UK is also the second largest foreign direct investor in Australia. Thus, the UK is a major component of the EU from Australia's perspective. And so therefore, leaving the EU changes very much the EU from an Australian perspective. And this is important because Australia and the EU are currently entering negotiations for a free trade agreement. So there's some real questions about what might be the nature of this free trade agreement now, and also how will it be negotiated as it's negotiated alongside the UK and the EU. And this would be similar for countries around the world that maybe already have free trade agreements with the EU, for example, and how might those free trade agreements, how might they be thinking about them at the same time as the UK and the EU are negotiating their own leave and the leave arrangements. So really the perception here too will be greatly shaped by leadership and policy choices in the UK. And so some Commonwealth countries, for example, are already reaching out and interacting with the UK and the EU in terms of Brexit. So for example, Australia and New Zealand are talking about working together are in relation to Brexit, and they're also offering direct assistance to the UK, for example, because so many new trade agreements will need to be negotiated. So a key question is how could other countries become involved in the negotiation process and beyond, and what would be their role and what would be the impact of that? Another key question down at the bottom of the screen is really, what impact will rating agencies have during the negotiation process and beyond, given that they affect interest rates in the way that they do, and a lot of signalling that happens. So this is a question we're not sure of what the outcome of the decisions of the rating agencies will be over the next, over the process of the UK negotiating to leave and beyond. On the next screen, there's also questions about if there's another significant global economic downturn, what would be the consequences of that for the EU and the UK. There's geopolitical questions that's around what if we see more civil wars, coups around the world, how will that conflict be addressed, what would be the expectation of the UK and the EU, as well as what would be the impact on the two. If a multipolar world really arises, how might this play out for the UK now it's no longer part of the European Union? How could a new Scotland-England nuclear weapons agreement affect nuclear proliferation, as Raphael was speaking about? How might international policy making, and in fact policy making within countries, change as well in the future? Is there a sufficient demand for the way in which we engage with the public and develop policy? Could that change in the future? And what new interventions might significantly improve economic production, or particularly around supply chains, for example, or 3D printing or things like that? How might that affect the supply chains in the UK and the EU and beyond? More generally, we're likely to see some global events that we can't necessarily anticipate at this stage, but what sorts of events is an interesting question to ask that could really trigger major changes for the UK. And then finally, how could changes in energy sources, prices, oil prices particularly, for example, and the impact of Scotland really impact not only Scotland but the UK and the EU in the future? Back to
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Trudy. I will encourage people listening in to send us some questions, and I will just read 3 related questions we've gotten so far for Trudy and Cynthia to start thinking about your perspectives on it. The first question was, why was it that the EU fought so desperately to keep Greece in and sort of let the UK leave so easily? Our second question is, why was this seen as a big surprise? Were there no contingency plans thought through for the eventuality of Brexit happening, both in the US and in the UK? And the third related question is the language of referendum, which is consultative, versus the Parliament deciding to apply for Article 50 and press the button of exiting. Is that a reason for not having done a lot of preparatory work, because you had quite a lot of time, first of all, to decide when to write the letter on Article 50. Once the Article 50 is written, you have basically 2 years to think this through, or should there have been more preparatory policy work? I'll leave those questions and I'll encourage more to come in. I'll pass the word here to Cynthia to round up with some big questions that remain and that we think would be well advised to be included in scenarios done for a Brexit or post-Brexit world. Cynthia?
Yes, thank you, Raphael. So we are doing just that. We're modeling for you some of the questions that scenarios are well tuned to address and to kind of develop ways in to render these uncertainties more clearly. Raphael's asked me to speak a little bit to, from the U.S. perspective, which I know best. And one thing that I notice, I think it's really hard to ignore the divisiveness that is shared in both countries. This occurs against a backdrop of globe-spanning terrorism. Potentially weakening the EU now introduces new geopolitical vulnerabilities. The United West would certainly feel more secure, but instead there's this shift towards isolation and nationalism, something that's perhaps better captured as nativism. Both places have large, misunderstood, and misrepresented segments of the population, people who have been left behind in the last decades of globalization, something that we're all given pause to think differently about. Such divided publics may continue to yield some surprising interactions. So I think that how democracy works is being contorted in new ways. Are terms like post-factual democracy, are they helpful? Is it a useful way to characterize these movements? Or is something else entirely emerging? Over here, Donald Trump is busy on his populist agenda, intent upon breaking the political machinery. And I've not seen on either side of the Atlantic strong alternatives proposed. It's all breaking without much sustained attention on what should rise from the ashes. So from a distance, Brexit feels like watching a messy and confused breakup, a breakdown rather than a positive step towards freedom and independence. There was not a lot coming across the airways about a positive vision that Brexit helps to achieve. Someone asked in one of the questions about why, why does this come as such a surprise, and why there was not good sort of contingency plans or a plan in place. I think that's an excellent question, and I really see that this lack of vision or plans has amplified the uncertainties that scenarios must address. I think there's a real hunger for clear thinking about pathways forward. Where will this voice come from? How will new directions be set? It's this anti-vision. What are the implications of that? Back to Raphael. I think it's quite interesting about the status of the referendum, referring to the recent question that this is supposed to be, it's treated more like a consultative thing. I think that it introduces, it opens up for Brexit not even occurring. Raphael, do you have further thoughts on that question?
Thank you, Cynthia. We have a number of questions here. One was, why did the UK support the entry of Eastern Europe into the EU, knowing that a lot of Eastern Europeans would want to come to the West? There's a very substantial proportion of Polish citizens, for example, living in the UK. And surely the question was, this was foreseen. Why did they want this in the first place if one of the big reasons that people voting for Brexit stated was the case, migration? So that's one thing for you to think about. And the other is, what kind of migration might a post-Brexit Britain have? When one reads through the press, whether it is the New York Times or the Financial Times, The Economist, Le Monde, El País, or whatever, it is clear that migration is a very big issue, not only in the UK, but right across Europe. You can see Donald Trump wanting to build a wall between Mexico and the US. And why is it so that migration has gone from being seen as a plus-sum game, where the young entrepreneurial migrants coming to the West contribute to the well-being of the country, to the well-being of the elderly by manning or womaning the old people's homes, hospitals, restaurants, and so on, whereas they are now seen as too many, and a wall needs to be drawn. Any views on this? In Australia, you've also had migration issues to deal with in the government, Trudy.
Yes, okay. So on that, I think there are two types of migration, or two ways of thinking about the migration. So there is certainly skilled migration, what some would call, I guess, orderly migration through the system. That doesn't get spoken, that's quite right, it doesn't get spoken a lot about anymore. It's like it's being overtaken really by the concern around refugees and asylum seekers. So it's a particular type of migrant that I think is what the question is pointing to, that has really grabbed the news headlines, whereas in Australia in particular, it's a very small percentage of actually the full number of migrants that actually come into Australia every year.
Right. So there's a question here about why there were such few young people voting. There have been suggestions in the comments in the press that if this vote were to have happened 5 years from now, when a lot of the older people that voted for Brexit had passed away, the vote would have been massively to stay in the EU. But the reality is that, according to the current statistics, that the proportion of young people that could have voted was low. Any views about what this says about democracy and how the young in the future will engage in national decision-making through voting? Cynthia, this matters to you guys in November.
Yes, it does as well. I mean, you know, what we've seen historically, it's always the case that that young people are not consistently going to the polls. They're not very reliable voters in that regard. Perhaps, you know, one can hope that the experience that you've had in Britain, where it does appear that young people's interests were not as well represented, that might encourage the younger population in the United States to become more politically activated.
Any views on that, Trudy?
No, Raphael.
Do you have an election undecided in Australia? Did the youngsters come out in strength to vote there, or is this a European and North American issue?
Well, the thing in Australia is that our voting is compulsory, so everyone is voting, and so yeah. And at this stage, we don't have a breakdown about the age groups. But having said that, there is this particular election, 25% of people, so it's not clear on what age, but were voting for parties other than the two big parties. So there was similar that we see around the world, an interest in independent parties, in other agendas, and wanting to have those sorts of alternate issues being proposed in a different way in the Parliament and being discussed. So it would be interesting to see what the breakdown of that what age breakdown of that 25% of people is.
Okay, thank you very much. We have three questions here. One small technical one. Somebody asked why I said that Italy might vote in a referendum to leave the EU. This is not from me. This is from a posting by Tina Fordham. Ford like the car, ham like the meat. Tina Fordham, one word, who's the chief political scientist working for Citibank. You can Google her posting online earlier today. The questions that we have received here, which I find quite interesting, is first of all, there's data apparently suggesting that only 3% of the US population has taken an economics class. And the question is whether this was also the case in the UK. Do we lack economic understanding for decisions like Brexit? I was in a conference on Tuesday where one of the speakers said that there was research done on the county that had the highest vote for Brexit, and that was the county in the UK with the highest proportion of people that had left school before 16. So the correlation was the more undereducated you are or uneducated you were, the more you would vote for Brexit. Any views about education versus voting patterns for the idea is the more educated you are, the more you vote for globalization. The less educated you are, the more you suffer from globalization. Christine Lagarde said the same thing on the FT video this morning. And so one way to have globalization that is more inclusive is to enhance the level of education. Any views on that, Cynthia and Trudy?
Well, I do think that there has, of course, been intense attention on the demographics of the vote, right, of Brexit, and sort of who is voting there. And there were some quite sharp divides around people who had higher education, living in cities. So that is a new fact to deal with. What's been interesting for me to notice is that many of the thought leaders, the people who are running the financial analysis of the implications of Brexit, and the kind of media elite are quite distanced from other large segments of the population. And so there are these divides that I think require greater attention.
Okay. There's two questions about the timing of doing scenarios for post-Brexit. One of the comments that was emailed in said, is it too early? Are there too many uncertainties short-term, too many factors? Is it better to wait and see till some patterns become clearer to start doing scenario planning? You did work, Trudy, when you were in the World Economic Forum in a very complex and messy world, which was Russia just before President Putin took his second term. Any views about the timing of undertaking scenario planning in terms of unfolding complexity? Is it better to start early, or is it better, in your view, to wait a bit till things start becoming clear?
It's a really good question, and I had wondered the same thing when we were going through the questions for the slides as well, because there is so much uncertainty in play. I think, I think that it also depends on what it is, the question that you're asking. What is it that the focus of the scenario work is about? Is there sufficient stability to actually be able to follow those questions and to be able to answer them in a constructive way? And if the ground is shifting too quickly and you can't answer the questions in a constructive way, then that may be an indication that it is too early to do scenario work. That would be my thinking around it.
So what would you wait for?
When the question, the topic, the purpose of the scenario work and the focus of the scenario work is when the questions that is really key to that, can you actually feel like you can answer them with some in a constructive way, rather than the feeling like the sand is moving every day. You just can't answer it. There's just too many outcomes to these questions. You can't constructively engage with them.
When you were advising the OECD on its own scenario work, would it not be the case that you would do a first iteration of scenarios, say this week, and then if new things happened, say the Conservative Party leader is elected or the Labour Party leader is deposed or some trade agreement is made or whatever, could you not then sort of update the scenarios and do this in an iterative way, as opposed to waiting for these set of scenarios to emerge?
Yeah, that's true. So then these would be much quicker scenarios, is what you're pointing to, Raphael.
Tentative scenarios that you update and change as things
tentative
progress.
Ones, yeah.
Yes.
So the question to that answer, the answer to the question that was raised is that there's no right time to do scenarios, but if you want to start clarifying opportunities as well as challenges, you can start any time and just make the scenarios an iterative process of sense making as you go along. If that process serves your purpose well, you could start at 5 o'clock this afternoon.
Yes, I share that view, that I think there's room for quick scenarios. I mean, what organizations need to do in these times of really intensive uncertainty is they need to be developing their sensory apparatus, right? Their ability to scan and to make sense of these sorts of changes. So as momentous and historically important as Brexit appears, it also just feels like another blip on the screen, you know, on the window of the world that's increasingly behaving in new and bizarre ways. I think that the comfort we might derive from certainty and stability, I think it's slipping away. I think all grounding is more unstable. So I think uncertainty is increasingly becoming this condition to be lived with and not just whisked away or smoothed over with assessments of probability. So I think scenario planning serves as window cleaning, you know, where you can get better resolution and perhaps see patterns more clearly. I think that scenarios can be done quickly. Sometimes I think about scenaric thinking. That scenaric thinking, a kind of orientation to uncertainty, is something that can be readily adopted and integrated into the way you do business, and a more extensive well-researched, deeper scenario planning project that might take months or, as we've seen, years to do, something like that might wait. But I think it's actually essential for organizations to develop this sensory capacity and this ability to sort of do a series of quick looks and quick sketches of scenarios that can evolve over time.
Okay, the questions that have come in have shifted from when and how to do scenario planning to issues relating back to Europe. And the person that had asked the question about why was Brexit, the possibility of Greek leaving the euro, fought so aggressively, and why was the UK not fought so aggressively by Europe? Has something shifted, or was it because Greece was in the euro and the British had the pound? Was that different? So that's question number one for you to think about. A second related issue is whether the press, and particularly the gutter press, as it's called, has sort of taken the role of education in societies such as the UK. So if you're uneducated but you read one of the popular newspapers, is that taking the place of education, and what does it spell, not only for the UK but for the rest of Western democracies, both in the rise of the extreme right and the possibilities of violence? Could there be violence, or will the revolutions be bloodless, asks one of the emails. Related to that is the announcement by the current Chancellor, the Minister of Finance, for those of you that don't live in the UK, to decrease corporation tax in at least London, if not the UK, to make the UK a sort of tax haven. And if the UK became a tax haven and attracted people, companies that way, would this increase inequality massively? And the last question is, Ireland has a territorial boundary with the UK. Also, the Good Friday Agreement is being, in effect, underwritten by the EU. So if Article 50 is activated and the UK applies to leave the EU, what happens to the boundary between Northern Ireland and Ireland? Trudy, any views on that first? Cynthia?
So just to kind of scroll back through some of the questions, the thing about Greece, it's a little bit of a puzzling question in some ways. And Greece was never voting to leave. There was just a financial problem that the EU was seeking to solve and to make work out. It seems from my perspective over here that the tough stand against Britain and sort of this permissiveness about letting them leave, as if that was a choice they had to make, it's because the EU has a stake in stopping it from spreading, right? So there was sort of some real big differences in Greece and Britain in this regard. So that seems to be something. I wanted to also pick up on the what strikes me as real, kind of provocative, right? This idea that has the press taken the role of education. One of the, as I mentioned earlier, it has seemed kind of like watching a train wreck or a nasty divorce, and there has been a lot of complaints of misinformation and false promises, and the media, of course, becomes the sort of megaphone from which these different views are spread. I certainly hope that the press doesn't take the role of education, of course, as a academic and scholar, but one could hope that the press can offer some also some balanced views, just in the kind of original intent behind media and journalism has been to inform the public. We have a completely different media landscape these days that enables each individual and each kind of faction to find support and evidence for their own views. And so I think some of the early promises around the internet and sort of the proliferation of and democratization actually of information has instead turned to something else where people can find evidence and support for their own views and live in their own kind of microcosm. So I think that the evolution of media, how information is shared and distributed, is an important uncertainty and kind of evolving situation that scenarios can track.
Okay, thank you. Trudy, you're back online?
Yes, I'm back online, Raphael. I was thinking too that this relates a little bit to the earlier question.
Can you get closer to the microphone?
Oh, okay. It's not clear?
That's better.
Okay. This question relates to the earlier question too about can we expect people to have had like economics education, and so I think it's the job of all of us, policymakers and politicians, to really be able to translate the key messages, because to expect people to have detailed economics training, for example, is not realistic, but to be able to translate the issues into things and ways that make sense for people is important. And then related to the media, of really teaming up with good people in the media and really building those relationships so that you can work with and getting your message out in a way that is effective and can be translated.
Going back to the question that was asked now 3 times about why was Brexit, where Greece is a very small country in the world and in the EU compared to the power that the UK has economically and otherwise. Why was there such a big fight to keep Greece in and such a small fight to keep the UK in? And could the EU, related to this, negotiate in such a hard way that eventually the British people say, well, actually, if those are the terms, we'd rather stay in after all? Is that a viable, plausible view, or will it be politically possible to accept staying in after the referendum, which was articulated as a one-in-a-lifetime, non-negotiable, no second chance opportunity, mean that Brexit is inevitable? Views from the US. Cynthia?
Without being a scholar of EU politics and really just thinking, I would just reiterate what I said earlier about I just think that the issue around Greece had more to do with the financial turmoil and upset, and with Britain it was related to this referendum and this wanting to leave and pull out. So the EU has a different stance and stake related to these 2 different places. I think that from a scenario planning perspective, you kind of what you would be interested in tracking is sort of the mindset and the agenda of the EU, right? If they're to keep with their original intent around European integration, which, let's not forget, it's a peacekeeping entity, a way to keep countries together and to have sort of common interests. And then you want to look at sort of the DNA of the EU in order to understand why they're treating different countries in different ways, right? They have there's a will there. So attention to different drivers that might pull that will in different directions would be kind of a goal of a set of scenarios.
So thank you very much for that. I'm going to follow that up with a comment that lead on to Trudy, because Trudy has been a keen observer of Europe, both from several years in the World Economic Forum, doing research on futures for Russia, futures for the Ukraine, and other activities, and then worked with the OECD. So she has a quite unique perspective. Would it be so, Trudy, in your view, that perhaps even more than watching what happens in Westminster a set of scenarios of what Britain might become depends very much on what the EU becomes and what the powers in the EU want. For example, there's been some comment in the weeks since the Brexit vote that a different relationship between the freedom of services and goods and people might erupt as a result of this, that there might be possibilities for limiting the freedom of movement of people if certain circumstances arose and so on. Any views about futures of Europe and the way this impacts Brexit rather than futures of the UK and how it impacts the EU?
I think that's very true, that it leads to the EU to ask lots of questions about why are we all together? What was the original impetus for the European Union? Does that continue to this day? If not, what should be, or what do we want the nature of our union to be? Absolutely, I think, because given how big the UK is by coming out of the European Union, it leads, I'm sure, to those questions about what is the nature of the union, why are we all together, what is the vision, what is it that we're actually working for? And I'm sure it will lead to those questions.
A piece of advice is if you're going to do work on the future of business in Britain, you would be well advised to do a very big piece of research on the future shape, size and nature of the EU. And as one of our listeners has emailed in, certainly Brexit is not off the table. There's still a ongoing conversation, and in this person's view, the current proposition on the table will not work either. Any final comments? We have 2 minutes before we close on the way forward for scenarios and strategy related to Brexit. I would like to close with 2 comments, and then I'll pass the floor to Cynthia and Trudy before passing the word to Damien. One way of thinking about Brexit is that it's a monumental, one-off, major break, sort of in the same standard as the fall of the Berlin Wall or the eruption of World War II, that this is a big, big game changer. You could possibly add 9/11 as a big game changer, and it's such a significant distinctiveness that it will stand in people's minds more or less the same as where were you when the second plane hit the World Trade Center. That's one framing. It's such a major thing, we really need to rethink everything from scratch. A second different framing is this is one of many different events. Where one starts we can discuss, but you could start with 9/11, or before that the tech bubble, and then there was the subprime mortgage problem in the US that became the financial crisis, that became the economic crisis, that became the euro crisis, that led to Brexit, and now it's Brexit, and something else will happen along the lines with, of course, the invasion of Iraq and the war in Syria related to this. So this is one of many different breakings of that. And depending on which of those 2 framings your board or your senior management team takes, you would create scenarios very differently. Any last comments, Cynthia and Trudy?
Yes, I would just say that I think scenarios can be a really important tool to help to structure public debate. We often talk about scenarios are a way to talk about the future that enables disagreement to be managed as an asset rather than a liability. So on the one hand, I've said that I lack this vision of what's to become, and so I wish that there could be this sort of forward-looking target that we'd be moving through. But scenarios are also helpful in in kind of oscillating between the dystopic futures that come so easily to us and those idealized, desirable futures, to try to find other levers for critique and analysis. So not just best case, worst case, but other logics of change that might be important. So I actually think it's a very useful tool to help to work through some of the wildly intersecting uncertainties that we've been covering here today.
Trudy?
I would just finish on the role and the importance of scenarios for facilitating the important strategic conversations, because as we talked about today, there's so many uncertainties, and both from the EU side and from the UK side, and I think just really thinking about scenarios as really one way of having great strategic conversation is really key to the current situation.
Well, thank you very much, both of you and all of the people that joined us. I just pass the last word to Damien.
Thanks, Raphael, and thank you all very much for attending today. It's been an absolutely fascinating debate, and thank you again for your questions. It really enriches the conversations we have here. If you have any further questions about the issues that we've spoken today, or indeed the Oxford Scenarios programme that we run here in Oxford, which is a comprehensive 5-day programme, the next iteration being the 3rd to the 7th of October this year, please do get in touch with my colleague William Lee on the details there that are in front of you. And as you can see on the screen, a recording of this webinar in full will be sent to you via email early next week. So once again, thank you very much and for attending.